The air hung heavy with the smell of disinfectant and something else I couldn't quite place, something metallic and faintly sweet. It was the smell of my job, poultry processing. I'd been doing it for a few months, just another face in a hairnet and white coat trying to make a living. The work was hard, the hours long, and the pay, well, it was a paycheck. Honestly, I didn't think much about it. It was just a job, a means to an end. I clocked in, I clocked out, and I tried not to think about what happened in between. My job was simple enough. I stood at the end of a conveyor belt, a metal river flowing with dead chickens. My task was to grab the birds, toss them into a bin, and send them off to be processed. It was monotonous, back-breaking work, but it was honest work. At least that's what I kept telling myself. The truth was, the sheer scale of it all was starting to get to me. Thousands upon thousands of birds, all destined for the same fate. I tried not to think about it, but every once in a while, I'd catch a glimpse of a beady eye staring back at me. A feathered head twisted at an unnatural angle. It was enough to make me lose my appetite, but I'd push those thoughts aside, take a swig of lukewarm coffee and get back to work. The plant itself was a marvel of efficiency, a symphony of steel and conveyor belts, all designed to process as many birds as possible in the shortest amount of time. It was loud, hot, and humid inside, the air thick with the sounds of machinery and the clacking of chicken feet on metal. The walls were white and sterile, the floors slick with water, and who knows what else. It was a far cry from the rolling hills and open skies I'd always imagined chickens lived in. The reality, I was learning, was far more grim. These birds never saw the light of day, never felt the warmth of the sun on their feathers, never scratched in the dirt for a juicy worm. They lived their entire lives in cramped, crowded cages, fed a steady diet of antibiotics and growth hormones, all for the sake of getting bigger, fatter, faster. It was an assembly line of life and death, and I was just one small cog in the machine. Every day, truckloads of chickens arrived at the plant, crammed into cages, their terrified squawks echoing through the loading bay. They were unloaded onto a conveyor belt, a relentless march towards their final destination. Many of them didn't even make it that far. The journey from the farm to the processing plant was often long and arduous, and many birds succumbed to heat stroke, dehydration, or sheer exhaustion. These casualties were simply tossed onto the conveyor belt alongside the living, their lifeless bodies indistinguishable from the rest. It was a grim reminder of the callous indifference that permeated the industry. Life and death, it seemed, were nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. My job at the end of this macabre procession was to separate the living from the dead. The living were hung upside down on another conveyor belt, their legs strapped into shackles, their heads bobbing listlessly as they were carried towards their fate. The dead were my responsibility. One day, as I was going through my usual routine, tossing bird after bird into the bin, I felt something different. I had grabbed a small, limp chicken, its feathers matted with blood and feces. It was so light I thought it must be nothing but bones. As I went to toss it into the bin, I felt it, a tiny flicker of life, a faint heartbeat beneath my calloused fingers. I stopped, my hand frozen in midair. I looked down at the bird in my hand, its eyes closed, its chest barely moving. It was barely alive, clinging to life by a thread. I felt a surge of something I hadn't felt in a long time, something akin to compassion. This wasn't just another bird, this was a living, breathing creature, and it deserved a chance. Just another bird. I called over to my supervisor, a burly man with a permanent scowl etched on his face. "Hey, this one's still alive," I said, holding up the chicken. He barely glanced at it. So, shouldn't we, I don't know, do something?" He let out a harsh laugh. "Like what? Give it mouth to beak? It's a dead bird walking. Just toss it in the bin." "But it's alive," I insisted, feeling a surge of anger rising within me. "Look, kid," he said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "I know it's tough seeing this at first, but you gotta understand, these are just birds. They're not pets. They're food. Now, toss it in the bin and get back to work." The awakening. I stood there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Just birds, not pets, food. But something in his words didn't sit right with me. I looked down at the chicken in my hand, its tiny heart still beating against my palm. It was then that I realized the truth. This wasn't just a job. This was an industry built on suffering, an industry that treated living, breathing creatures as nothing more than commodities. I couldn't be a part of it anymore. I couldn't be complicit in this casual cruelty. I tossed the chicken into the bin, but not the one my supervisor had indicated. I gently placed it in an empty crate nearby, hoping against hope that it might somehow survive. That night, I didn't sleep. Images of the plant, the conveyor belts, the mountains of dead chickens swirled in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been living a lie, that I had been willfully ignorant of the suffering that went into every chicken nugget, every chicken sandwich, every chicken pot pie. A voice for the voiceless. The next day, I walked into my supervisor's office and handed in my notice. He looked up at me, surprised. "What's this?" he asked, taking the crumpled piece of paper from my hand. "I quit," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Quit? What are you talking about? You can't just quit." "I can and I am," I said, my voice growing stronger. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be a part of this." And with that, I turned and walked out of his office, out of the plant, and into the bright sunshine. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I could no longer be silent. I had to speak up for those who couldn't speak for themselves. I had to be a voice for the voiceless, honoring the one. That experience at the poultry processing plant changed me. It opened my eyes to the horrors of factory farming and the devastating impact it has on animals, the environment, and our health. I vowed to never eat meat again, and I dedicated my life to advocating for animal rights. I started volunteering at animal shelters, rescuing neglected and abused animals, and educating others about the importance of animal welfare. The journey hasn't been easy, but it's been worth it. Every time I see a chicken, I remember the one I couldn't throw away. I remember the tiny flicker of life in its eyes, and I'm reminded of the countless other animals who deserve our compassion and respect.